Reddit. What dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? Story 1. I found out when I was in my early 30s that my mom had not only had 4 kids, but actually 6, but gave 2 up for adoption before I was born. Also, I was the last baby she had with some rando before she married my stepdad, and she had intended to give me up for adoption as well. Silver lining? One of the babies she gave up contacted her a few years after I learned about this, and now I have an awesome new brother. Story 2. My paternal grandmother had an affair with our small town's mortician in the 1940s. She got pregnant, and he performed an illegal abortion. The fetus was buried behind the funeral home he owned where we kids used to sled every winter. My dad told me this as I was getting ready to take a ride down the hill on the sled when I was 12. Also, my paternal grandfather had multiple illegitimate children around our small town. Turns out, one of my best friends was also my half-cousin. My father told me when I was 17. My father was educated, intelligent, honest, and moral. The fact that his parents were so wild was absolutely shocking to me. Story 3. My mother grew up in the American South. Her brother died in his early 20s, and she always told me it was a freak accident. A bullet came through the window, killing him. They lived in a rural area, so I never questioned it. One year, I inherited an old Korean War officer's sword after my grandpa passed. My mom freaked out and told me that it was too dangerous to keep and that we should sell it, or get a safe to lock it up in. I thought it was weird, so I asked my dad, and he got this sad look on his face. Turns out my mom's brother was brutally murdered with a similar sword in the 80s. He had gotten involved with some drug dealers, and they thought he had snitched about one of their big deals that got busted. No idea why they decided to use a sword, but it was pretty messed up to hear about. My mom had to ID the body. I found this out when I was 16, but she never directly acknowledged it until years later. My mom said he was just trying to make some extra cash by introducing people who partied to the dealers. I'm about his age now, and I can see how he just thought he was making a quick buck, never thinking something like that would get him killed. Story 4. My dad's side of the family has ties with the mafia. Thankfully, my mom has long since divorced my dad, and they live a decent distance apart. I heard stories of my mom's parents who lived close by at the time circling the block in their truck late at night soon after the divorce, to ensure no one was there to hurt us. I was very young at this point, probably like 4, so I really have no memory of this. I do remember one night our garbage can was burned to the ground, and my mom has since told me about death threats soon after the divorce. My mom, a couple of years ago, watched a documentary on prominent mafia families and noted multiple names that were at her wedding. Story 5. When I turned 21, my grandfather told me a story about his older brother that I had never heard. My great-uncle was a big boozer for most of his life. He passed at 92 and by then had switched from liquor to beer and wine. He also cut down to 1 pack of cigarettes a day instead of 2 after he had half a lung removed. Pap and my uncle grew up on a farm in the 30s and 40s. Mostly the family ran the farm by themselves, but from time to time they would hire drifters on as farmhands. In 1950, my uncle and one of the farmhands were out drinking, and they were driving back to the farm in my uncle's convertible. My uncle was the one driving, and he misjudged a turn that had a steep bank on the right side. He ran the car up the embankment, which was steep enough to flip it. My uncle was thrown from the car, but the farmhand he was drinking with was only halfway out of the car when it landed. Pap said he was severed clean into 2 pieces. Because the farmhand was just a drifter without any family to make much fuss, and because the Korean War had just started, my uncle was able to enlist and avoid any criminal charges. He was in Korea until the end of the war. That was the only time I've ever heard that story told, and although I would never be someone who has more than a few drinks before getting behind the wheel, it is something that definitely sticks in my mind. And it is a story I will tell my own kids when they get their license. Story 6. My dad left when I was 7, and we were always told that it just didn't work out with my parents. We saw him off and on for about 2 years after he left, then never saw him again. He had remarried, and she had a kid that became his stepson that my brother and I would hang with when we would go to my dad's house. Then, when I turned 13, my mom finally told me that the stepson was actually his son from having an affair with that woman. So that kid was my half-brother, and I had no clue. Story 7. I think this counts. My whole family found out at the same time about the dark secret. I was 25. My great-grandparents left their spouses for each other. Great-grandpa was 37, and great-grandma was 19 in Ireland. My great-grandpa had 7 children. My great-grandma had 3. They left their spouses and children in the middle of the night to run away together and moved to America. Didn't say a word and never talked to them again. When my grandpa, their only child from their new life, would ask them about their past or family. They got really weird and would refuse to say anything. They took the secret to their graves. My grandpa at age 70 wanted an explanation about his heritage, so he signed up for Ancestry and 23andMe. Could you imagine how shocked he was to find out he had 10 siblings? They had been searching their whole lives to find out what happened to their parents. He got to meet them, and would travel to visit them twice a year. My grandpa died 4 years ago. At least he got to know his siblings for a bit before he died. Happy, sad, and screwed up all at the same time. Story 8. We'll also submit a light one here, the story of my grandma's real name. Let's say that my whole life I knew my grandmother's name to be Mary. Everyone called her this. Everyone knew it. One day when I was in my 20s, I was with my grandmother and saw her sign some legal document. She signed it as Edith. I was horribly confused. I asked Grandma about it, and she said her name was Edith, but it was never spoken, and to not use it. She is in her 80s at this point. Apparently, my great-grandfather had been an Air Force pilot stationed in the UK during WW1. He had a girlfriend at the time named Edith. After the war was over, they broke up. Great-grandpa returned home and married great-grandma shortly after. They had only one child, a girl, whom he named Edith. Roughly 18 months later, my great-grandmother saw a letter in the mail from an Edith and figured it out. She vowed the child would never be called the damn name ever again. She went by her middle name, Mary, though it was never legally changed. My own mother states she did not know her own grandmother's name until she was 22. I have had fun randomly dropping this name bomb on cousins here and there and enjoying the shock and laughter about it. It is a silly secret that nowadays just makes people giggle. Story 9. Growing up, I always knew my parents had marital issues. Constant fighting. A couple of times Dad disappeared for a few days living in his car, issues with drinking. But they stayed together, and when I asked why did not they divorce, they always said they loved each other too much. And in the past few years, things seem to have gotten better. My parents, in fact, are now so comfortable in their relationship that they make jokes about all the awful stuff they have done to each other in front of me. What I have managed to put together is, my parents met when they were 14, and my mother was dating an 18-year-old, and my dad would relentlessly ask her out until she eventually dumped her boyfriend for my dad. My mother went on to university after college. We are in the UK, whereas my dad dropped out of college and went straight into work while constantly drinking and partying. It was at one of these parties, while my mum was studying, that he cheated on my mum with someone from their old secondary school, so she dumps him. Barely a year later, my dad realizes he does not know how to do anything for himself. No one else wants him, and he goes crawling back to my mum. She agrees to take him back, but only if he marries her. Not immediately, but eventually, she said. He agrees, and a short year after that, aged 22 now, she is already pressuring him to propose. He fumbles it frankly. We're in Paris, but forgot the ring, and proposed back in the hotel room after they had visited the Eiffel Tower that day, which was her dream proposal, but she says yes. A month after they are married, Mum pressures him into having a child that he does not want. And 9 months later I was born, they soon realize how hard having a child is, and basically pawn me off on my grandparents for the rest of my childhood. After me, there were 2 more accidental babies, and each time my dad threatened to leave her if she did not abort them. She managed to convince him to stay while keeping my siblings by promising he would not have to raise them. He did not, but neither did she, frankly. I did. And that is only what happened before or shortly after I was born. If I carried on into my childhood, we would be here for years. What they sold to me as the perfect love story, been together since they were 14, proposed in Paris, soon married and had children because of pure love, is in fact a bunch of skewered half-truths from a horrible, twisted love map of my mother's manipulation and my father disappointing her time and time again.
Story 10. Not super dark or super secret, but when I had to do a project on my family tree in elementary school, one of the questions was, when did your family immigrate to America and why? For one of my great-grandfathers, my grandma told me life was very hard back in his country and it was getting dangerous to stay there. And for a long time I thought, yeah, I can see that. It was probably hard for a teenager living in Poland with World War I right around the corner. And I'm sure it was. But it turns out it's even harder and more dangerous when you're a teenager who has slept with a married woman and then accidentally killed her husband when he confronted you. I can see why she didn't want me to put that on my elementary school project. Story 11. My great-grandmother was shot dead in the street by an ex-boyfriend in front of my 4-year-old grandma and her 2 younger brothers. It happened in a really quiet European town, and I believe it made the papers. Grandma ended up being sent to live with an aunt, and the boys stayed with their father, and he remarried a nasty, abusive woman. I didn't know this until I was 18, from the older boy, actually, Uncle Jay. But hearing this story really changed my perspective on Grandma and the boys. The boys both ended up going to prison and having difficult lives, and Grandma was a stern, unemotional woman. I feel like this gave me some understanding as to why. Story 12. I was told by my aunt, before my parents thought it necessary, that my dad had cheated on my mom and slept with a stripper, and that I was her daughter and not actually my mother's. I found out years later that my dad wasn't actually my dad either, though he thought he was, which is why he put his name on my birth certificate and brought me home when my birth mother wanted nothing to do with me. Fun times. Story 13. Just found this one out recently. My uncle was a doctor working in a small-town hospital. He was married and had just had a baby boy. While his wife was pregnant, or just had the baby, he had an affair with 2 nurses in the hospital, and ended up getting one of the nurses pregnant. When he found out about the second kid, he took his family and left to New Zealand for 3 years. Upon returning to Canada and the same small-town hospital, his wife immediately found out about his illegitimate child and divorced him. My illegitimate cousin stopped coming around to family events, and when I talked to him about it last year, he told me that my grandparents always blamed him for ruining my uncle's marriage. Story 14. I found out I had a sister who had been given up for adoption. The only reason I found out was the person who informed me no longer felt bound to secrecy after my mom died, and the person who told me had receipts solid enough that I have no reason to doubt them. It also explains why Mom freaked out when I told her I'd done a 23andMe test. Story 15. Found this out after my grandfather died. Growing up, every older guy in the neighborhood would say how tough he was. I mean, he was the most intimidating man I'd ever met. You would jump if he sneezed. I'm not even exaggerating, but I'd never seen him actually fight, but everyone, and I mean everyone, women and men, would say he never lost a fight and usually never had to throw more than one punch to knock someone out. Simply put, he was a bad mother ducker. But growing up, he would always preach to me and my cousins to never fight if you could help it. Just walk away. If they're insulting you, just walk away. It's only words. Sticks and stones and all that. He'd drill it into our heads that you never fight unless you have to, and never under any circumstances do you throw the first punch. Ever. I was kind of confused. Every older person in our neighborhood would tell me how nobody messed with Blackie because of how many people he knocked out, and he would always tell us not to fight. Turns out, when he was in his 20s, he got into a fight with someone. Apparently, the guy kept insulting him and wouldn't leave him alone. Finally, he had enough and cracked the guy, knocked him out with one punch. Problem is, when he landed, he hit his head on a step. It was lights out for good. Killed him with one punch. I had never heard this story and was confused about how he didn't get locked up. Turns out he did. Got like 15 to 20 years or something like that. Then World War II happened. When I was a kid, I'd always ask my mom how my grandfather entered the war. Was he drafted or volunteered? She'd say, oh, it was like the movie The Dirty Dozen, which I had never seen or had any interest in when I was young, so I had no idea what that meant. Turns out the Army made him a deal. Go to the front lines in Japan. If you live, we'll expunge your record. If not, oh well. He went. Things made a lot more sense after that. Story 16, my mom's cousin, my second cousin, molested her growing up multiple times. She was apparently getting molested herself by her brother, I think. Later on, that cousin got married to a guy who went on to molest their daughter they had together. Came out later, he was keeping a treasure trove of child pornography in the house, with bits of their daughter included in that. He was busted by the police, which ended in a shootout in some random business building, made the news and everything. He got shot and died during this whole ordeal. They're probably the 2 most messed up individuals I've ever known. Story 17. Finally, I got one. From when I was aged 6 to 13, my mom dated a fellow named Murray. We all lived together in an old farmhouse. Murray was a wonderful father figure to us. But he also had a drinking and driving problem, and after a particularly nasty accident, Mom waited until he came home from the hospital and was well enough to take care of himself before leaving. The whole time we lived there, my sister and I never went down into the basement as it was infested with spiders. I always thought it was because of the drinking and driving she left him, but as it turns out, that was only part of it. The other being that he had a massive grow-up for weed in the basement. Mom stated had the police found out about this, she would have lost custody of us. Murray has long since passed, but he would have had a giggle that weed is legal here now.
Story 18. My grandmother raised her nephew after his parents died. I don't know what I thought happened to them, probably just assumed car accident. When I was 14 or 15, I asked my mom what happened, and she told me that it was a murder-suicide. Then she told me way more details that I probably shouldn't have been told, and told me not to say anything to him because he had blocked it out and didn't remember most of the details. Years later, we were talking, and in the middle of an unrelated conversation, he said to me, "I remember everything. It just came to me a few nights ago." I didn't know what to say, but then he asked if I knew the story and said I kind of did. He went into detail, and it was not fun, but I could tell it was cathartic for him. Next time I talked to my mom, I let her know that he remembered and may get the same conversation. That was the last time I heard anything about his parents, though. Story 19. My extremely wealthy uncle was going downhill quick with Alzheimer's. Before he was too far gone, he apparently made a deal with my aunt that when things got to the point that they would have to send him to a nursing home, she would end his life instead. He wrote all of this in a letter and gave it to the attorney of their estate. When the time came, I don't know why she chose to shoot him in the back of the head instead of something less violent, but she did. It was a pretty big trial, with a fair bit of news coverage, and it really blew up when the lawyer testified and brought forward the letter. My aunt served like 2 years, I think, and was released on parole. Story 20. Found out when I was about 32 that apparently in 1973, my dad had a daughter he never knew existed. I found out because he texted that to me while I was working, after finding out about it himself about 1 week earlier. She was in her late 40s by that point, I think. What's sort of tragic is, all this time we thought I was my dad's only kid, and he always wanted a daughter, but never got one due to marriage's ending. He would have loved this girl. His daughter was the result of a one-night stand with a girl he never talked to again, and according to his daughter, the mother had a mental breakdown not long after giving birth and never really had custody of the daughter anyway. Dad never would have had any way to find out. The baby grew up with the mother's parents in another state, and the mother kinda went AWOL while escaping. He died when I was 7, and one of my few memories of him is an image of those scarred legs. Well, when I was 23, my great-aunt, his sister, told me that it wasn't a fire. Their father ran a bath with scalding water and put my grandfather in it as a punishment. Great-grandfather was an abusive, alcoholic piece of shit who messed up his son. Story 25. An older relative murdered her husband in cold blood. The daughter lied on the witness stand by testifying that her dad beat her mom. He didn't. The mom was a drunk, and the father was threatening to leave her and take the kids. Because the courts believed the lying daughter, the murdering mother, kept custody of the kids. The victim's family cut off my whole side of the family after that, including their perjuring granddaughter and her descendants. Now I know why. Story 26. My father is from a small working town in eastern Ukraine, and most of our lives we've been poor. But my mother always praised my father for his ability to know the perfume by smell, and not only that, but also he can recognize many famous perfumes by smelling them. Once, when I was 20-something years, I asked, "Why is that so?" Where did he obtain this skill? My father asked me to never tell this story to my mother, and here's the story. My father had a close friend who was actually a secret lover of one of the most famous Soviet singers who officially had a wife. But in reality, he was gay, and did a lot for the gay community in the Soviet Union. He brought a lot of expensive things from abroad, like new music, clothes, and perfumes. And a lot of those perfumes had been met at secret parties. This gay friend of my father also gave him all the fresh music releases on vinyl, and he sold it, and they shared the profit, unofficially, of course. That's why my dad knows the release years of most hits from the 60s and 70s. And more than that, he told me about a special square in Sochi, the place of Olympic Games 2014, where gays of the USSR met each other and what secret signals they had. Nice. Update, I was probably misunderstood. That secret gay friend of my father was the only gay my father knew. All info about gays of USSR he knew from that friend. Parties, that I mentioned above, were not for gays. They were just normal parties for counterculture youth. The gayness of his friend was a secret. Everybody at these parties was wondering where did he get all these goodies rare in the USSR, but he never answered. My father was allowed to know, only because he knew that friend from childhood. They were like relatives. Okay, even if my dad had some gay experience, it's fun to know LOL. Story 27. When my father's dad died, the secret was out. Grandpa was an evil man who bootlegged liquor, stole cattle, and kidnapped Indian children to sell into slavery. He had a very public mistress, and coming home from a bender, he knocked up his wife.
my grandma. In order to save face to his mistress, he took the knitting needles to Grandma, thus infecting her to die of sepsis in territorial New Mexico in 1929. My dad was 6 with a younger brother 4, left to grow up as virtual orphans. Despised by the aunts and forbidden help from their uncles, my dad and his brother grew up in the Depression, almost starving, while their dad lived it up, traveling and committing many crimes that were easy to get away with because it was the Great Depression. Story 28. I had an aunt that I never met and never knew she existed until very recently. I don't see that side of the family almost ever because they kicked my grandma out of the family after she married a half-black guy. Anyway, this aunt spent the last 30 years of her life in Ancora, an inpatient psychiatric hospital. She lived a perfectly healthy and normal, albeit extremely racist life, until she was in her mid-40s. Then she found out that she was 25% black through some chain of events I still don't fully understand. Ducking, lost. She was so full of hate that her brain could not accept this information, and it broke her. She would just scream the N-word at people, and didn't really communicate in any other way. I'm convinced Dave Chappelle heard this story and made his black-white supremacist skit. She stayed there until she died. I know extreme hate like that can mess with people's brains, but I mean, come on. Story 29. My dad's friend committed suicide by shooting himself in the head in front of my dad and some other friends when he was 15 years old. They were all hanging out at the friend's house having a good time, when he went upstairs, grabbed his father's pistol, and came back down calling everyone's attention. He then put the gun to his head, squeezed the trigger, and collapsed behind a couch. They all thought it was some sort of sick joke at first, until they looked over the couch and saw his body and the blood. I first heard this story from my mom when I was 18, which explained some of my dad's behavior towards toy guns when I was a kid, but I never brought it up to him. I just hoped that one day he would open up to me about it, and eventually he did. But we haven't talked about it much since then. I'm amazed how my dad turned out to be such a great man having to experience something awful like that at such a young age, but according to him, it's something that never left him either. He still has nightmares about it, and gets really uneasy in movies and TV shows when they show someone getting shot in the head. Story 30. Not so much dark as it was annoying, and made me question everything, but I found out my biological dad actually was in my life for a few years. My family told me for most of my life that he left before I was born because he was a deadbeat that couldn't take responsibility. In my 20s, I found a photo of him and me. My brother told me everything. The truth is that apparently there was an incident where Mom went a little crazy on him, and he got arrested and left afterward. From then on, I took everything they said about him with a big grain of salt. Still never met him and don't really have a desire to. Just upset me that they lied for so long. Story 31. Circa 1994, my dad died 32 on Christmas Day. Instead of his family consoling my now single mother of 2, they decided it would be more appropriate to use their spare key to enter our house and clean out all his belongings while we were picking out a tombstone. All his tools, clothes, pictures. He was a model. Then Grandpa on Dad's side takes my mom to court while she's mourning to try to prevent her from using his life insurance to raise us. Sister and I were 5 and 6 at the time. He wanted all the money to be set aside until we were 18. The judge pretty much threw his case out. Needless to say, my mom distanced herself from his side. I don't speak with them either. Found this out when I was like 20. Story 32. This might be a bit too weird for this thread. I am from a country still enshrined in a lot of superstition and religion. My great-great-grandmother was a crazy woman who practiced witchcraft. One day her husband died unnaturally. EIRC, he was murdered or something by the village, and Granny went mad. She gathered the village folk around and picked up a rock from the ground nearby and declared that the rock will be her curse, and the village will suffer for killing her husband. After that, she killed herself. For multiple generations, my family worshipped the rock as a deity and prayed to lift the curse from the village. It ended when my father, in his 20s, got sick of his family doing stupid stuff. Him and his cousins stole the rock overnight from someone's house and threw it near a railway track. And no, I wish I was making this stuff up, but my father, uncles, and aunts all told me this story when I grew up. Story 33. My great-grandparents got drunk and locked 2 of my uncles out of the house late at night in the middle of winter. My great-grandparents wouldn't wake up and my uncles couldn't get in, so they tried to walk to their grandma's house that was like 15 miles away, and one of them froze to death, and the other had to have his feet and hands amputated because of frostbite. My great-grandparents lied about what happened and said they snuck out. It was in the newspaper and was made out to be this heartbreaking story about two dumb little kids who snuck out in the middle of the night because they wanted to see their grandma. Story 34. Husband's family has a dark secret that still isn't out to the people who really need to know, and I hate that I know. His youngest aunt was sent away when she was a teenager, and shortly after she returned, the oldest uncle and his wife introduced the family to their daughter. Young aunt went on to have 3 more kids who have no clue that their cousin is actually their half-sister. What's even more messed up is that her brothers know the secret. I'm dreadful that someone will need a donor or do an ancestry test and all the lies will be exposed. Glad I could get that off my chest. If you're assuming this is a good Christian family, you would be correct. It's all about appearance. Story 35. Several actually involving my paternal grandfather, Pa. He was a cattle rancher and long-distance truck driver. Pa was a terrible alcoholic who beat my granny on several occasions. My father was the one who would save her. He took several beatings doing this until he was old enough to stand his own against his drunken father. He ran off and married another woman that he had been having an affair with for years. He had 4 boys with my granny and 4 children with the other woman as well. When Granny found out and found him, she took him to court, and the judge sent him home with her to raise my dad and uncles. She had to write the child support checks until the youngest turned 18. He had several children with other women, only a few we actually knew about. In his later years, he was proud of all the kids he had all over the country. One of his daughters moved in with him after Granny died, and a couple of years later they had a daughter. They were both fully aware that they were father and daughter. Story 36. A family member walked in on my mother, breaking my arm by holding me only by it when I was 2. Didn't say anything for fear of breaking up a family. Mother abused me my whole life, and even after cutting contact 3 years ago is still trying to ruin my life. This family member told me the story casually and acted as if they'd done me a favor because I could have ended up in care. Had to pull back from all of them now because of the realization they were all bystanders and let it go on without a word. Story 37. My mother got pregnant when she was 17, so her and my dad were going to ask her parents for permission to marry. Instead, they got an ultimatum: get an abortion, or be sent away to a home for unwed mothers. My mother got the abortion and married my father 2 weeks after her 18th birthday. She proceeded to have several miscarriages and stillbirths, almost certainly due to the damage done to her uterus and cervix. My brother was conceived with medical assistance, and I was a lucky surprise. My parents are still married 46 years later. Story 38. My grandma had an affair with a Catholic priest while she was married and then left her high school sweetheart who she had 5 children with. Then she ended up living with said priest, and her kids had to lie and refer to him as an uncle when people asked them about their living situation. I always thought it was true love. I found and kept letters and notes they wrote each other when he was overseas with the military, and it seemed so genuine, and I'd always heard so many nice stories. And I suppose it could have been true love. I was raised to believe that my biological grandfather, my dad's real dad, was a monster. I had been under the impression he left my grandma and abandoned his 5 children. My one aunt died in a drunk driving accident, and he couldn't be bothered to show up. I never met him my entire childhood. I was literally encouraged to actively hate him. They said he remarried, and basically started a new family, and was controlled by his wife. The priest essentially raised my dad and aunts and uncles, and they have always revered him. He died before I was old enough to have any memories of him, but I'd always looked at him with a positive light. He'd taken my grandma and a couple of the kids to Hawaii, bought my grandma a Suburban, and the house was in his name. My grandma was even left his military benefits, still unclear on how this was finagled. He paid for the kids' colleges. He had an incredible life. He had pictures with Bob Hope and other celebrities, got to travel to a ton of places, etc. One day, I was curious if he had any relatives alive and if they had ever known about this salacious relationship. Then I Googled him, and it changed my life forever. He, posthumously, was accused in a lawsuit with a large group of priests of wrongdoing over an extended period of time. You can guess the nature of the lawsuit. It was on several law websites, and I found the lawsuit papers. Surely enough, his name was mentioned. Unease began to ensue. I did more digging and eventually found a 16-page document. This document was specific to him and included a police report and internal Catholic Church investigations into his transgressions, among other things. Early into his priesthood, he was accused of harboring a runaway 14-year-old girl. He had explanations for everything. Of course, reading the police report was absolutely devastating, because it seemed like the police did no due diligence and nothing came of the report. Then there were pages worth of internal Catholic Church investigations in which I learned he would have young, distastefully dressed girls hanging out in his rectory and was drinking and showing up to events and/or not showing up at all. He once said he had been called by the military and was away from the church, except he lied and had been drinking, gambling, and philandering with women. Members of the church and other priests wrote anonymous letters about his conduct and asked for his removal. There were bouts of rehab and probation, but he was moved to another church. Some of the same antics occurred. You get the picture. This man my family had told me to revere as a literal godsend was in fact nothing of the sort. Then I found a summary of all his transgressions over the years that led to his retirement. This is when I found out when he took my grandma, dad, and his 2 siblings to get the Suburban, he physically assaulted my grandma and assaulted and kicked my dad and his siblings. I cross-referenced all of this information with birth years, where they grew up and lived, and the fact my uncle still has the Suburban. I was by myself when I found all of this out, and I've asked my dad if he's ever looked him up, and he said yes. So he knows of the lawsuit, but I haven't asked if he dug as far as I did to find this 16-page document. I don't know how to approach this, or if it's even worth bringing up to him. I'm curious how much he knows, and if he remembers being assaulted. I'm also extremely disturbed if they knew of his past and chose to lie to me about this man. If they didn't, then my heart breaks for what they endured with years of lies, abuse, and the hurt they felt. It also makes me question my grandmother and her choices and everything she subjected her children to. My dad and aunt reconnected with my biological grandfather a few years ago. He eventually came to visit us from across the country. I was in my mid-20s meeting my biological grandfather. I am truly apathetic to him and forming a relationship with him. My mom's mom had 2 husbands, and those were my grandpas. My grandpas and grandmas have all passed now, so I've mourned losing all of my grandparents. I do not feel this man is my grandfather, and have been at peace with this for a very long time. However, it's made me realize my grandma abandoned him. He was the one who came to the church with the suspicion she was having an affair with the priest. At that, my heart breaks for him. The priest also did my aunt's funeral. So while some piece of me feels I can't forgive him for not going to his own daughter's funeral, I also can't imagine having to face a priest who my wife ran off with. I'm so torn that my family pitted me against this man, that is my biological grandfather, when this priest was clearly a fraud and lacked human decency and morals. It is also clear that my grandma made extremely questionable decisions and, with other unrelated reasons, has tarnished my vision of her. Needless to say, one of my wild facts has changed significantly from my grandma fell in love with a priest. Truly, so conflicting and heartbreaking. Story 39. My grandma and uncle were both diagnosed with cancer in the 90s. My uncle went into remission, grandma died. Almost a decade later, my uncle's cancer came back in full force. He and his partner of 40 years were hoarders. My mom didn't realize this initially because they lived about 2 hours apart. She only knew after her first visit to help take care of him. We all made several trips to help clean up. On one of these occasions, Uncle's common-law husband mentions he needs to hit up the P.O. box as they haven't collected mail in a few days. Mom offers to drive him. When they get back to the house, Mom notices a letter from the IRS addressed to Grandma. Weird because Grandma hasn't been alive to file taxes in almost 10 years. Turns out Uncle and Grandma had a joint bank account. He never notified authorities of her death. She still got direct deposits from Grandpa's government pension post-mortem because the government didn't know she was dead. Not only did my uncle illegally receive thousands of dollars of my grandma's pension, but he also had several maxed-out credit cards. He knew the cancer coming back was a death sentence and decided to live it up while he was still here. Story 40. My cousin was hit and killed by an 18-wheeler when she was 6. The dude was on his phone when it happened, and they went to court, decided to drop the charges on him, but his company refused to pay them anything for damages caused and whatnot. A few of my uncles, who were a part of Hell's Angels, were buddies with some people on the police force, got this dude's address, killed him, and then torched the trucking company to the ground. They were never caught. Story 41. I was 6 or 7 when my father died. He was a terrible alcoholic, but I didn't understand alcohol as a kid. I'm 19 now, and my mother has told me he wasn't just an alcoholic, he was a chronic liar, manipulator, and abuser. He strangled a dog and killed it in front of my mom because she was going to leave him. He was addicted to cocaine, and when he didn't have any alcohol, he'd make my mom go get more, or he'd kill another animal. He'd frequently beat the ever-living shit out of my mom. And when she finally left, my entire family, both on my mom's and father's side, talked shit about her for leaving and didn't care about mine or her well-being. The worst part is, when suing for custody, he actually got weekends, and then on Sunday would take me to the super nice churches that judges and lawyers involved with the case went to. Story 42. My great-great-grandfather had 2 cousins that got married. Their kids turned out fine, but one of their 3 grandkids was disabled. Years down the line, the disabled grandkid murdered both of the grandparents that were siblings/cousins. He shot them at a family reunion because he felt like they were taking away his parents' attention. Or at least that's the story that has been passed down. Story 43. My granddad's parents were collaborators in World War II. He was only 6 when the war ended, so he was innocent. But his dad regularly hosted Nazi officers who ran the city where they lived and helped them arrest resistance members. My grandmother's parents were actually resistance fighters and helped downed British and American pilots escape and hide, as well as provided passports to Jewish people. Kind of a wild story, but that was the state back in the 1940s here. Either you kept your head down and kept a low profile, you helped the Nazis and profited from the occupation, or you fought them wherever you could. Story 44. One dark, one kind of strange. One of my uncles, actually my mother's cousin's husband, confusing I know, was this really funny guy who laughed all the time. I found out when I was an adult that every relative kept their young daughters away from him, as he was very inappropriate with them. The strange one, my uncle was married twice. The first marriage was annulled. His children, now all very much adults, do not know about this for some reason. Story 45. My great-grandfather was a Nazi and a traitor to our country, Norway. He held political office during the war, and his case is listed in the treason settlement case. We were never told about him or about our ancestry, nor the fact that our family up until the 60s held special privileges as a result of our ex-times grandfather getting letters patent from the king for his trading, and fishing village that had been in the family for 300 years. What in Norwegian is called a veier or nesekonge, petty king who owns sizable tracts of land and has special privileges with trade of goods, fish, and yada yada. My mum grew up hearing about this stuff, how special and grand they were because of this, and rightly said this is ridiculous. I was almost 30 before I knew any of this. Oh, and our ancestors owned plantations and slaves in the West Indies, so that's a thing. Also something like my 6 times great-grandfather started the genocide against our country's native peoples. So all in all, lots of assholes. Story 46. When I was 15 or 16, my parents got liquored one summer night with a bunch of their friends, and I was told the story of how our house was bought from a murderer. The dude and his wife lived in the house my parents bought for, I think, 10 years, maybe less. Whatever triggered him, they didn't know, but he beat her to death with a cast-iron pan and strangled her with a belt for good measure. He left the body in the backyard, poorly buried. He tried to kill himself by drinking a gallon of WWD-40 and drowning himself in a body of water very close to where I live. However, he tried to drown himself when the tide was coming in. Wasn't very successful, and the police found him half dead on the beach the next day after a neighbor got super suspicious about the grave in the backyard and also all the sketchy noises he heard the night before. I think he got 15 years for it, but I have no idea what his name is. I couldn't pry that part out of my parents. But his name was the last one on the house before my parents bought it when I was 4. Story 47. My relatives were a wealthy, childless couple in Chicago. Their housekeeper, who had a baby, took ill and was hospitalized. The couple took the baby to California and raised her as their own. This baby, Marie, grew up without siblings, as my grandmother's cousin. Marie discovered the truth as an adult, by accident. Even though this kidnapping happened over 100 years ago, I always wondered what became of that poor woman who was released from the hospital to find her baby had been kidnapped by her employers. I have a set of china dishes from Marie that I use at Thanksgiving every year. Wild story. Story 48. My Caucasian mother was high on drugs and cheated on her Caucasian husband with my African-American biological father, and no one knew about it until I was born and didn't match the luggage. Destroyed my parents' marriage, and that guy still ended up raising me and financially supporting me. It's been really complicated growing up. I thought I was adopted, up until I was 10. My mom doesn't remember the night I was conceived at all, but we eventually found the guy. Story 49. I have a cousin who I was informed is special needs. Never understood why, only that he was a bit of a slow learner and had some minor health issues. Found out when I was a teenager he wasn't really a blood relation. His mother married my uncle, my mom's brother, when they were fresh out of school. She was pregnant, and everyone assumed it was his. The baby was not his. My aunt had been repeatedly raped by her father her entire life. She finally ended up pregnant. My uncle and her were dating but never had penetrative sex. She told him the truth after she found out she was pregnant. They decided to raise the baby themselves to keep it away from her father. The only way they could do that was if they got married because she was still under 18. My uncle raised my cousin as his own, even though he knew he wasn't. They loved and cared for the kid. Due to the circumstances surrounding his conception, he ended up with behavioral and health issues, but was loved and given everything they could give him. He still doesn't know. He's fine, just still a bit slow. Story 50. My mother-in-law got married, in her late 60s, to her current husband about a month after his first wife died. My 22-year-old niece commented about how short their courtship must have been. Only, if you don't count the decades that they were having an affair, I replied. My niece was flabbergasted that this had happened. Her mom walked by, and my niece said, "Mom, did you know that Grandma had an affair?" "You mean with husband or a different one?" she replied casually. We had to have a sit-down and talk through any other obvious secrets that she may have missed. Her aunt never had kids with her first husband because he was gay. Her step-grandmother had been her grandfather's secretary right up until the time he divorced her grandmother, etc. Story 51. My family has been involved in organized crime for multiple generations. My dad went clean and ended the cycle when my brother and I were born because he didn't want us to be criminals growing up. He kept a suitcase full of blackmail evidence so no one on either side of the law could come after him. I only found out a couple of years ago when I was helping him clean and came across the suitcase, and it was full of weird random garbage like Polaroids of random people and receipts from Home Depot. I was going to throw it away and my dad freaked out that I had even opened it. I made him explain, and he said his dad forced him into the family business through guilting him that it's something our family's always done, so you're gonna have to learn, and he always resented his dad for it. Story 52. My grandparents were rather poor, and when all of my grandfather's crops had failed, they were desperate. They had a lot of mouths to feed, as the church didn't allow them to use birth control. They applied to the local Poor Fund, which helped the poor make ends meet, or at least put some food on the table. But my great-grandfather was on the board of the fund and denied their request since he didn't want people to know a son of his was using the Poor Fund. What would people think of him? He'd rather keep his pride than to feed his own son and grandkids. And that's why now, about 70 years later, over 50 of his own offspring still curse his name. This was not the only awful thing he did to keep up appearances. Story 53. Not really all that serious, but I was really surprised when I found out. When I was 25, my dad told me his brother was actually only a half-brother from a different man. My grandfather fell in love with my grandmother, and she never told him she had a kid until he proposed, which was a big deal back then, having a child out of wedlock. My grandfather, upon finding out, immediately opened his arms to him, and a few weeks later, Nana and Pop were married. They were ostracized from his family for quite some time due to the social stigmas of those times. But their love never flinched, and eventually, the family got over their nonsense. They would have been married 65 years this year. Story 54. My grandfather is a serial predator to young kids, and his kids were no exception. My grandmother knew, but did nothing. It was an open family secret that everyone tiptoed around. Out of the 3 kids, my dad and his siblings, 2 became predators themselves, my father carrying on the messed-up tradition with his own kids. Once you hit about 14 in my family, you got keyed in on why we didn't see Grandpa and why my aunt and uncle were never in the same room with each other. Story 55. A few. I didn't find out that my dad had a first wife until I was 22, and that was totally by accident. I also found out that my grandma embezzled a lot of money from her parents and had to pay it back to her brother later after they died. She also stole from my parents' food truck business, then lost all of her money gambling, and my dad was quietly paying for everything of hers. I also found out that my dad was a big-time bookie in my city and got raided by the feds when I was a baby. Just found this out in my grandma's stuff after he died last year. Story 56. That my dad was treated like shit by his parents his entire life. Oh boy, this is going to be a long one. For the sake of the story, my grandfather will be dipshit and grandmother cuntylocks. It wasn't until I think I was about 8 years old I realized my dad didn't have the same type of relationship with his parents like my mother has with hers. I pretty much didn't pay attention to anything, unless it really caught my attention. I'm autistic, with ADHD, Try to get me as a kid to focus on something, good luck. So I can remember traveling with my dad and brother to his parents' house, and what normally happens is I would go straight to the living room to watch TV, because I was terrible at socializing. And they had channels we couldn't afford to have, plus, this is when Star Wars The Clone Wars was on TV, so I wanted to watch it as much as possible. I literally sat down for 30 seconds, and then there was shouting, to which Cuntylox says to my dad, "You never phone." Now bear in mind, Dipshit would phone my dad every night, and he'd speak to both of them, plus we'd go up once every 1 to 2 weeks to see them. So I couldn't understand why she was angry. Next thing I know, I'm back in the car, and my brother and I are trying to just calm our dad down. He was upset rather than angry, but we still made sure he was okay. I think, like a few days later, she apologized to my dad via phone call, and things went back to normal. I can't remember all that was said, but these are the highlights from what I was told over the years. They never took him to rugby practice. They made him cycle almost 30 miles a day in total. Unless it was raining, in which he paid for a taxi, but it couldn't pick him up outside his house. He had to walk about 5 minutes from the house to the end of the road to get it. The reason? His parents were worried about what the neighbors would say about them having their son catching a taxi. My dad, when he was a kid, I think teenage years, had an argument with Cuntylox, so she told him to lean over a table, which she then struck him with a pool cue. The pool cue broke. My dad's wedding day. They were telling people that my mother wasn't good enough for my dad. My dad had to have his leg amputated in 2015. He spent about a month in the hospital, and during that time they were constantly telling him about people who died. It gets better. He's diabetic. And Cuntylox is too, though she treats it like it's not that big a deal. They bring him a massive box of Maltesers and a tray of jelly pots. The nurses, when they saw, were genuinely shocked by this. At this point, my brother had enough of them, so he didn't care about upsetting them. He phoned them and asked them if they could stop telling my dad about people who died while he was trying to recover from his leg amputation. Cuntylox took offense to this, and began shouting at my brother over the phone and called him, a 23-year-old man, a little squirt. My dad didn't know about any of this until like 4 years later. They pretty much avoided contact with my brother up until they needed his help, and even then it was painful for them to speak to him because they didn't know if we told my dad about their behavior. Christmas, 2018. Dipshit comes down the week before Christmas to give us cards with money in. He hands them to my mother, who isn't someone you want to piss off. I speak from personal experience. She sees one for her, one for my dad, and one for me. Nothing for my brother. She immediately realizes this is going to cause a gigantic shitstorm and gives them to my dad. He says nothing about it until Dipshit is about to leave, then brings it up. Asks him if he forgot my brother's card in the car. Stupid duck doesn't think this is a get-out-of-jail card for him, and instead says to my dad that my brother never bothers with them. Gee, I wonder why. My dad then tells him that he won't treat any of his sons differently and gives them back. Dipshit says goodnight to my mother and leaves. That was the last time he ever saw my dad because they never spoke again. November 2019. 3 days after my birthday, which was probably one of the best ones I had, my dad dies. He was rushed to the hospital, and then a few hours later my mother phoned me to say my uncle was coming to pick me up to take me to the hospital. I got there, and my brother greets me, asks me how I am, and has the best poker face I've ever seen because he shows no indication that something's wrong. We walk around to this corridor, and I see those cunts. Still think nothing's wrong. A nurse asks me who I was, and I explain. They immediately point out that they are his parents. The nurse genuinely didn't give a duck because my mother told them what they were like. I go into this room where my mother is holding back tears, and it immediately hits me like the worst pain I've ever felt in my entire life. I've broken bones, been in fights, had my heart broken. None of that compares to the pain I felt that day. I knew before my mother said what she was going to say. For the rest of the night I was numb, like I couldn't feel a thing. But Dipshit, oh Dipshit, couldn't be a normal human and try to comfort his grandchildren and daughter-in-law. Oh no, he decided to start talking about this ducking TV show he saw about recycling and how much rubbish there is in the ocean. He says this to my uncle, mother's brother, who wouldn't leave me alone and was trying to make sure I had someone there. Now, yes, rubbish in the ocean is a very serious issue we are facing. But bringing it up when I'm trying to process the fact that I've just seen my father's lifeless body on a table is not the best ducking time. I excuse myself to go to the toilet because it's taking every ounce of willpower not to punch this ducking cunt. Fast forward to the funeral. Beautiful service. I told my best friends about the funeral, and they made it clear they were going to be there no matter what. It was a short service with a Whitney Houston song playing at the start, as it was my parents' wedding song, a short speech, and Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell to close, which surprised a lot of people. The Reverend was surprisingly keen for us to use that, like he didn't even ask for alternatives considering this was at a crematorium. After the funeral, a number of people came over to myself, my mother, and brother to give us condolences. Cuntilox never spoke to me, only Dipshit. He came over, shook my hand, gave me a hug, and said the words I will never forget. "You're a man now." Yep, you read that right. Those were the words he said to his grandson at his father's funeral minutes after the service. That was the last time we ever spoke. After the funeral in January 2020, they never paid us a visit or phoned us again. Not that I'm complaining, it's the best thing they ever did for us. Fun fact, November 2019 was the last time I cried. Have not been able to cry since for whatever reason. If you read all of this, thank you for taking the time to do so. I apologize for any mistakes I made. I hope you can understand what I've typed.
Story 57. My great-grandfather was a white guy married to a black woman. He went to World War I and came back to find his house burned down and wife, father-in-law, mother-in-law, and sister murdered. He proceeded to find out that the local good old boys had done it, so took out his war trauma on them, killing, dismembering, and burning them and their houses. He then burned down the local church and courthouse to make a point and moved to New Zealand. Story 58. I thought my grandparents disliked my aunt's husband because he was a cold, arrogant ass. Turns out that wasn't the only reason. His entire family shamelessly supported a far-right military coup d'etat that tore and continues to tear my country apart. The husband and his brother took up arms and actively participated in the coup. Well, the husband ended up sweeping that part of his past under the rug and climbed the political ranks to a rather elite position, while his brother, who actually gunned down political opponents, fled the country because he knew he'd be hunted down if he returned. Story 59. My grandma and her siblings were removed from her parents and placed in boarding schools for Indian children. Her parents did nothing wrong, but one day, someone came and removed what kids they had. Then every kid afterward was taken. This happened in the 1930s to 1940s. I'm not 100% sure on the exact dates. My grandma was white passing, so she was adopted, aka sold to a couple. Her siblings went to the school that beat and punished children for speaking their language. Story 60. I'm 25, and recently found out the man I know as my dad isn't my biological father. My biological father left my mother shortly before I was born because he believed he was an angel sent by the archangel, Michael, to prepare for Armageddon. His family probably doesn't even know I exist. Last my mom heard of him, I was 10, and he was going to court for assaulting a teenager, so I hope he's having a phenomenal time getting his ass beat in prison. On the lighter side of things, the man I know as my father met me on my first birthday shortly after he started dating my mom. Apparently, we spent the day eating fruit snacks and watched Teletubbies together. He pretty much adopted me as his own in that moment, and knowing who my biological father is doesn't change how I see and how much I love my dad. Story 61. My grandmother's older brother got a high schooler pregnant when he was in his mid-20s, back in the 1940s. They had a shotgun wedding, and the girl moved into the farmhouse, without running water, that he lived in with my then 13-year-old grandma and their parents. The girl ended up leaving with the baby a few months later without telling anyone one day when he was out at the farm doing chores. That was a family secret enough. It was never spoken of. He remarried to start a different family and moved out. People only started discussing it quietly after he died in the 1980s. Well, my grandma is a big genealogy fan, and when 23andMe became popular, we got her a testing kit for Christmas in 2019. By taking the kit, she actually found her long-lost niece who was living on the West Coast and now in her 70s. They reconnected on the phone, and my grandma found out just how violently abusive her older brother had been to his teenage bride. That poor girl had given up the baby for adoption to a pastor, and his wife, who thankfully loved her dearly, and she went on to have a normal life. But she never saw her mom again and only learned this information from her adoptive parents. I think speaking with her missing niece really traumatized my grandma, seeing how she was only 13 years old and a fairly sheltered farm kid from the Midwest. I think her brother also told his family awful lies about why his new young wife up and vanished with the baby. I only learned all of this after she took her DNA test in 2019. P.S. Her brother's second wife died of alcoholism, and their only children, a pair of twins,
are pretty messed up people. Story 62. My uncle was the #1 heart surgeon in Japan. One day, as he was finishing his rounds, he was held at gunpoint as a Yakuza demanded he perform life-saving surgery on the head of that particular Yakuza family at the time, as he had been shot in the chest. This particular Yakuza boss was notorious for being a despicable human, assault of all types on both women and even children. My uncle was known for having super steady hands. He used to be nicknamed Steady Freddy because he loved the movie Freddy Got Fingered. During the operation, the Yakuza boss passed away due to a mistake that caused a severed blood vessel. The Yakuza threatened to take my uncle's life, which resulted in my uncle going on the run and hiding in a fishing vessel without any food, money, and unable to speak English. He managed to board a cargo ship to the USA where he got given a job by a warehouse worker at a paper company. Now, he has a wife, a good job, a beautiful home, and a car. The truth being, my uncle didn't make a mistake. He disposed of that Yakuza boss on purpose.
Story 63. So, not sure if it counts, but I almost learned something. One time when my dad was very sick in the hospital, he looked at my brother and me and said, "I wasn't going to tell you this, but maybe I should now." The moment he said that, the machine he was hooked up to showed a massive spike in blood pressure. We waited. Then Dad changed his mind and didn't tell us. We still don't know what it was. He did pass sometime after that. My brother thinks he might have had an affair. I did find a letter my mother wrote to herself years back, hidden in her nightstand when we were emptying the house, saying how sad and lonely she was. Story 64. My family is enormous, like absurdly huge and spread out across the globe, stretching from Canada through Europe and across the globe to Australia. We've largely made contact with each other and everyone knows the history. It turns out, my great-great-great-grandfather had 7 wives over his life and several children to each one of his wives. The dark part, however, he wasn't a man about town charming ladies into bed. He would obtain these wives at a young age from the local workhouse, Victorian Britain. Said wife would bear several children to him and then mysteriously come to an untimely death. He would then go back to the workhouse and get another wife, who would again bear several children. The family tree, which is largely complete back to the 1600s, has an interesting explosion of members in the 1800s. Story 65. So turns out a cousin of ours was a big-time mobster in a famous city. We never met him, but here's the story. Before I was born, 70s, my parents go on vacation with my older brother. He's like 2. Their car breaks down, and they use all their cash to get it fixed. They drive to the famous city, and the car breaks down again outside a hotel that isn't where they had a reservation. They go in, explain the situation, and the guy behind the counter is a complete jerk. But they had no cash. They offer a check. Guy says he needs ID. My father shows him, and the guy's whole attitude changes. Don't worry about it. The night is on the house, etc. Calls a mechanic for them. Cheap fix. But of course, it's all on the house. He just said, "Tell him I took care of you." Okay, great, thanks. The guy's a ducking psycho. They come home to our small town. 23-ish years later, we are doing a job at this guy's house. Now, my father growing up was a tough guy. Apparently, he and his brother were not to be messed with, and I never saw the man cry or be scared. So we are at this random house where the old Italian owner comes out and is talking to us. Asks me my name and asks my dad his, my dad says our last name, and the owner says, "Oh, are you X's kid or y'all kid?" And my dad says X's kid. He's never heard of Y. The owner says in a very distinct way, "Whatever happened to him?" And my dad went ghost white. I could almost see his skin crawl. We researched and found out who Y was and who him was. Apparently no one used his name, just him, and my middle name is his first name. 6 years later, I'm talking to a girl. I met her through a friend at a party. We are talking, and she's telling me about how her grandfather loved this one particular song. I asked, where's her grandfather now? She says he got caught up with the wrong people. Always wore disguises and went by a different name. Went to a certain state and was never seen again. They said he was going senile because if I ever go missing, it was him. They'll know what you mean. Story 66. That a very wholesome-seeming, religious, upstanding family member is actually a raging nymphomaniac. The person is well known in our area's sexually inclined circles, has burned through multiple marriages, and broken up many more marriages and families. Some other people in the family knew about it, but it all came out into the open recently, and for that person, very embarrassingly. Look, I don't judge anyone's wants and desires, and I think sexuality is none of anyone's business. But this family member has inflicted mental anguish on multiple partners as well as bystanders. Story 67. That I was adopted by my aunt and her husband. My real father, her brother, was institutionalized after taking too much acid and losing his mind. He had ES'd and remained in the hospital until he passed away. My real mother was Swedish and was a heroin addict and was unable to look after me. I was still in a pram at the age of 3 and unable to walk as I'd never been taught. I have 2 sisters by the mother who I've never met, who probably don't know about me, and they were taken into care by social services. The real mother is believed to be dead now and was untraceable. I had a sad, hard, often cruel, and unloving childhood. As the adoptive mother felt she had been lumbered with me, I found all this out at the age of 21 and had no idea at all about any of it. I'm now 53, happy and grateful. This is only a tiny part of my life that has been rocky to say the least. Oh well, that's life, I suppose. Story 68. My whole young adult life I was told not to spend the night at boys' places, that I needed to wait until marriage to have sex, that I shouldn't move in with a partner until we were married, etc. This caused me to deal with a lot of guilt and shame around my dating life throughout my 20s. When I was a teenager, my older brother knocked up his now wife when they were 20 and unmarried, and it felt like the biggest scandal to hit my family. My parents and grandparents were not supportive of them. It wasn't until I was almost 30 that my parents revealed to me that my grandparents eloped in Vegas because they had conceived my oldest aunt out of wedlock, and that my parents secretly lived together a year before they were married. Not big dark secrets to me now, but I can't help but feel like I live in a family full of hypocrites. Story 69. When I was about 10, I got a hamster for my birthday. It got out one night, and my mom found it while I was at school the next day. No harm done. When I was 18, my older brother told me our dog ate that hamster, and our mom replaced it with a different one while we were at school. I didn't believe him, so we called our mother. She said my brother is an asshole and not to listen to him. I said it was almost 10 years ago, and I wanted to know. She stuck by her story. When our father got home that night, I asked him how many hamsters I had. His response was, "Oh my God, like 4."